Well, welcome everyone to our next lecture in the series Illicit Objects, Lived Religion. I'm Joseph Sanzo, the director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion, and it is my pleasure to introduce Lilian Diniz, who earned her PhD in European Social History from the University of Padua and the University of Vienna in 2017. She's held research positions at Freie Universität Berlin, the Madrid Institute for Advanced Study, and the Roman Islam Center in Hamburg. And she is currently a research fellow and lecturer at Foscari University of Venice. In 2025, she was awarded a Marie Curie Global Fellowship for a project on conversion and apostasy in Visigothic Iberia, conducted in partnership with Northern Illinois University and beginning in September of 2026. Her research examines the intersections of popular religion, healing, magic, and women's roles in the early medieval Mediterranean. She's also the recipient of the 2024-2025 Heidi Marks Prize from Remedy, which stands for Religion, Medicine, Disability, Health, and Healing in Late Antiquity, for her contribution to the study of medicine, health, and healing in the ancient world. So, Lilian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I would just like to start, of course, thanking Joseph and Piera for this invitation and for the opportunity to present this work today. So I also want to um, say from the outset that this is very much a work in progress. So I have been thinking about this topic for quite some time and slowly working on the paper, but what I will present here today still needs a lot of polishing. So some ideas and even also the conclusion are a bit tentative. So I very much appreciate this opportunity to share this with you, and I would love to have your feedback and suggestions. So what I would like to explore today is how local clerics in the early medieval Iberian Peninsula functioned as cultural brokers. And my analysis focus mainly on written sources from the 6th to the 10th century, more or less, within the political context of the Visigothic kingdom. But I will go a bit before and after this, and also beyond Iberia to when it's helpful for comparison. And the concept of cultural broker comes from anthropology, so particularly from the work of Eric Wolf, and I will be talking about it in a minute. But I use it to describe these figures who operate between asymmetrical systems of power, so individuals who translate norms and meanings and practices across social and cultural boundaries. So, in the context I'm studying, these cultural brokers, they often operated at the intersection between what we might call licit and illicit forms of Christianity. So, they mediated between the two and translated both literally and metaphorically practices and expectations in both directions. So, we find evidence of clerics consulting auguries and engaging in divination, sometimes perhaps for personal reasons, but also producing lots and or amulets or drawing under clerical authority to respond to the needs and requests of local communities. So in this sense, they appear not only as believers in practices officially condemned, but also as active producers of them, which highlights their role as intermediaries. So these phrases, they stood between episcopal orthodoxy and local expectation. So between what we can call learned theology and lived religion. And their role was not simply to transmit doctrine from the top down. So it was also to render Christianity workable and translate it into intelligible fashion. So, but if they develop this role as translators, we know that translation also implies transformation, and transformation can be read as betrayal and subversion, and this will be something that will come back very frequently in the sources. So I would like to explore this ambiguity through four questions. So first, who were these brokers? Then what did they know? And what were they doing to be considered as um, practicing these illicit practices and to be considered as brokers? And why did ecclesiastical authorities consider their actions as illicit? Because we see that sometimes what they were doing what was not considered illicit. So I was trying this last question actually I've tried to answer it, but this is what I pretty much need your feedback to help me answering. So by addressing these questions, I hope to show that these local priests were neither simply passive transmitters of orthodoxy nor merely corrupt deviants as they are very often portrayed in the sources. So they rather function as mediators, so operating in a liminal space. But before we can turn to the evidence, I would like to just briefly set the scene by outlining the methodological framework, because of course this is not coming from out of the blue. So I would like to begin by tracing the origins of this concept of cultural brokerage and how it has been taken up and developed in the study of late antiquity and early medieval religions. So while the concept of cultural brokerage is not new, or as it is this character that embodied the role of a cultural intermediary, the term cultural broker only emerged in mid 20th century anthropology, and particularly in studies of colonial and post-colonial societies concerned with mediation between local communities and external powers. And the work of Eric Wolf, this article, Aspects of Group Relations in a Complex Society, Mexico, which was published in the 1950s, is considered as foundational because he describes brokers as individuals who link communities with larger political and economical structures. So even though he was not properly using the term cultural broker, the concept was already there. And it was then coined and further developed by Clifford Geertz, who was studying peasant societies and how, in this context, some individuals acted as intermediaries navigating asymmetrical systems of power. So, more recently, historians and anthropologists studying religion and empire have implied that um, have applied this concept to missionaries and clerics and ritual specialists who translated not only language but symbols, norms, and cosmologies across cultural boundaries. So across these fields, the cultural broker has become has come to denote actors who operate in liminal positions, so negotiating, translating, and reshaping meanings. So I'm not, of course, the first to propose to see local clerics as intermediaries in this context of early Christianity. And the idea that clerics were acting as intermediaries between lay communities, and and between these lay communities and this institutional church, and as well as between everyday religious practices and broader structures of Christianity, was already in the work of Aaron Gurevich, and he understood the biculturalism required of the clergy in the period of religious transition. And although the translation of his work is from the 90s, he actually published his work in Russian in the 70s. And then we have The Rise and Function of the Holy Man by Peter Brown, who fundamentally reshaped our understanding of religious authority in the later Roman world. So he argued that the holy man was not merely a charismatic ascetic or a relic of popular religiosity, but he was socially embedded and he was mediating between village communities and wider structures of power, so imperial, ecclesiastical, and divine. So following this trend, we see a lot of publications. I would just cite some that are very relevant for my work here, but of course it's not the only literature in it. And in the 2016, it was published a volume, Man in the Middle, and this book works with the concept of clerics as being men in the middle, so intermediaries between the ecclesiastical and the lay, the literate and the illiterate world. So here they are seen more as practical and spiritual and also bureaucratic intermediaries than as agents of cultural transformations. As cultural intermediaries. And more recently, David Frankfurter had emphasized in many publications, not just the books that I'm showing here, but also many articles, that Christianization of the Eastern Mediterranean was largely advanced by local and charismatic leaders that rooted in indigenous religious culture. So the significance, however, implies that Christianity itself was reshaped at the village level. So it's a demonology, ritual practice, and saving symbols were refracted through the synthetic religious vision. So here they're seen as figures who condemn temple cults, but they could also deploy traditional religious techniques and produce amulets and so on. But working specifically with the concept of cultural broker in the early medieval period, we have Helmut Reimitz, who sees historiographical works in Carolingian empires, such as those of Gregory of Tours, as a work of a broker. And he will want to quote Reimitz. He says that cultural brokers can be seen as creative performers in social contexts, characterized by a complicated interplay of local and extra-local influences. But these brokers do not only develop new perspectives for the integration of their societies, they also maintain the tensions and differences between different social groups and identities, which provide the dynamic of their actions and the basics of their social prestige. And this is very much an interpretation that I share and that I use to understand this literature. But, well, I just want to cite another two works. So also Bart Coet investigates the role of deacons as go-betweeners. And more recently, we have Clemens Gantner, who applied the concept of cultural broker into different contexts. So he understands the papacy as a broker between East and West. And in another article, he also calls Athanasius Bibliothecarius as a cultural broker between the Carolingian court and Constantinople. So drawing on these approaches, I propose to view these local clerics in early medieval West as themselves cultural brokers. So we will see that the sources suggest they operated in contexts where firm ecclesiastical control was often limited, and this autonomy brought them closer to local communities and their needs. And I think this is crucial to understand their role. And however, it was not a role that was simply to link lay and clerical words, but also to translate the religious message into forms that were intelligible, and also to create new and rituals and new ways to see and to live religion. So in the sense, the broker is a liminal and bicultural figure. So he has a foot in both worlds, and he's able to conceptual translation of in both directions. So, and to function effectively, he must establish relationships of trust with those who rely on him. So now let's try and move to the first of our core questions, because we need to know who were those brokers. And to understand their function, we must first situate them socially. And an early document to the ecclesiastical organization of northern Iberia in this period is preserved in a document that is called Parochiale Suevorum, which was compiled in the late 6th century in the Suevic kingdom of Galicia. So there's a map that we have here. And this document lists Episcopal sees and their dependent churches and reveals a network of ecclesia, which is embedded within pre-existing territorial and settlement structures. And what is striking in this is that the Christian landscape appears more extensive than episcopal control alone suggests. So we see in this document that here we have a map with all the places that are mentioned in this parochiales. We see private foundations, so basilicas and monasteries that were established within villa, and that were not always fully integrated into the diocesan structure. So this imply a patchwork ecclesiastical geography where oversight could be negotiated and uneven. And operating in these spaces very often independent and very often far or even out of the control of the bishops were local priests. And to define as local priests, I will use a definition that is given by Wendy Davis in her chapter in that book, Men in the Middle. And she calls these local priests are those of the countryside associated with a named church and operating alone, or more probably as a member of a small group of priests or minor clergy. And these were not necessarily marginal or impoverished figures. Many of them relied on family resources rather than institutional ties, and some even owned property, and some even owned churches. And it has also been suggested that many rural scribes in the later period in the 10th century, they were actually priests. So they were not literate, but they have also legal competence. So these were men economically semi-independent, socially embedded, and often only loosely supervised by bishops. And these local priests were then expected to assist their flock in virtually every sphere of life. So their responsibility extended beyond strictly sacramental duties, such as baptism or penitential discipline, to matters that we might classify as more secular, including, and we will see in a minute some examples, so a protection against evil forces or threats to livestock and dangers to the harvest. And this broad set of expectations reflects a holistic understanding of pastoral care, so in which spiritual authority encompasses the material well-being of the community, as which was well stated in a couple of articles by Karin van Rijn. So in the Iberian context, we find clerics performing blessings and prayers over seeds and the wet, the vineyard, first harvest and fields to be sown, which was attested in this document that I'm showing here, the Mozarabic liturgy, which was a liturgy compiled probably in the 7th century. It was used in the peninsula until the 10th century when it was replaced by Roman rite. So this reflects a broader pattern that is also visible elsewhere. We have sources also in the Carolingian context, a concern for agricultural livelihood that drilled the clergy and the liturgy into practices whose roots reach back to much earlier. And so closely related to this agricultural focus, we have another document, and this time is Slate, and is known as the Cario slate, which is dated to the 8th century, and it was discovered near Cario in the Asturias, so northern Spain, uh, in the right bank of the river Navia. And Francisco Javier Fernandez Nieto has identified it as a phylacterian, so a protective charm intended to shield its owner from specific dangers. And in this case, it was meant to protect farmland from hailstorm, and it's written in Latin, invoking angels, saints, and Jesus Christ. So Fernandez Nieto suggests it may have been produced by a well-to-do and educated Christian landowner, uh, and it could be a priest. And this person was familiar with late antique models of phylacteries still circulating across the provinces. So our local priests would not only perform the sacramental duties, but also administer notarial and communal roles. And even more, they were probably producing and performing rituals that require a ritual knowledge that extended beyond the normative ecclesiastical. A normative, however, that is always up to debate. And so the priests were not strangers descending upon villages from urban cathedrals. They were often drawn from the very communities they served, and they lived among their parishioners, sometimes with families and dependents. And they attended banquets and they knew local elites. So they were immersed in village rhythms. And this embeddedness is vividly illustrated in the writings of the 7th century hermit Valerius of Bierzo, who was living more or less in the region of Galicia that I showed you. And Valerius is a particularly interesting source because he composed what is considered one of the earliest, if not the first, fully developed autobiographies in the Latin West. So his work, his autobiography, is divided into three narratives and is notably, and he's always, not only in his autobiographies, but also in his other writings, he's very critical of clergy and monks. This is a theme he returns to other writings on monastic life. And in one of these autobiographical accounts, he attacks a priest named Justo. And I want to read with you this description of Justo, not just because it's interesting for our case, but because Valerius is also very entertaining. So he says, against my will, they ordained this fellow a presbyter. He achieved this honor for no other reason of his being chosen except that he adopted every kind of scurrility which is proper to willful luxury and the brashness of manifold madness for the sake of boisterous humor, and because he was adept in the sort of art of eliciting music from the lyre. On account of these running like a glutton to banquets at many houses, he attained through the lascivious harmony of his frequent singing a great reputation for music. After he had reached ordination unworthily in his insane arrogation of so high an honor, he even dared through a hypocritical pretension to profane holy religion. So for why he publicly displayed a simulated sanctity in the eyes of man, in secret he was carrying out a truly diabolical iniquity. I think that beneath the polemic, and Valerius, he's very polemic, but beneath this polemic, he described Justo as someone deeply integrated into communal life. So, from Valerius' perspective, this proximity signified corruption, but from another perspective, it might indicate precisely the kind of social immersion required to gain the necessary cultural fluency for becoming a cultural broker. So these local priests were not outsiders imposing doctrine, but insiders navigating expectations and engaging very closely with their communities, their needs and anxieties. So if this was their social position, we should now move to our second question. So, what did they know? Um, at least in theory, clerical education in the Visigothic kingdom was rigorous. So I'm just citing a few canons, but it's way more extensive. So the First Council of Toledo 400 was still under the Roman rule and fighting against the heresy of Priscillianism that was very popular in this region, particularly in Galicia at the moment. So this kind of emphasized uniformity of practice. And then the Second Council of Toledo of 527, which was already under the Visigothic Arian king Amalaric, mandated the schools for clerical formation. So then under Isidore of Seville in 633, we see that bishops are required to establish educational structures and to provide institutional booklets. So now in this context, and talking specifically about Isidore, we know that he envisioned an educated priesthood. So they should be literate in Latin and trained in scripture and versed in canon law, of course, and capable of preaching and administering the liturgy correctly. And his pedagogical program was inseparable from a broader project of ecclesiastical reform and consolidation, in which education functioned not just as intellectual refinement, but also as prophylaxis against error. And in this context, what we called paganism and superstition were framed as demonic deception. So the clergy were uh, uh, they have to distinguish orthodoxy from these illicit practices. Yet, the records of councils suggest persistent anxiety about what is written to be clerical ignorance and deviation. And we see repeatedly that bishops and presbyters were being reproached for consulting diviners and neglecting their studies. And one particular case that I would like to see with you here is the case of Bishop Marcianus of Astagi. He was accused of consulting a fortune teller. So the case of this bishop was originally addressed at the now lost Third Council of Seville of 624, which was presided by Isidore. And during this synod, Marcianus was charged with consulting a divina named a woman named Simplicia, in order to obtain projections concerning both his own future and that of the reigning king. And Rachel Stocking, studying this case, she suggested that the proceedings of this council may have been intentionally suppressed, possibly under Isidore's authority, since this episode, this whole story, survives only through a later exculpatory decision that was issued in the Sixth Council of Toledo in 638. So this whole episode was apparently a political dispute in which another bishop, Aventius, used intrigue and false testimony to usurp Marcianus' position. Nonetheless, this circumstance amounts to an implicit knowledge among the episcopate of the perceived efficacy of these divinatory practices, which is rendered explicit by the previously, what I just mentioned, the Fourth Council of Toledo, which was again presided over by Isidore, and it was attended by 66 bishops from Gaul and Hispania. And I cite this number because it was very widespread. I mean, there was a lot of people there. And so here it is, he says so if any bishop and presbyter or deacon or anyone belonging to the clerical order is found to have consulted magicians, aruspices, and soothsayers, augurs, or diviners, or those who claim to practice any such art, or others engaging in similar practices, he shall be deposed from the honor of his rank. So this ruling is presumably a response following that whole case of Bishop Marcianus. So it's also expressing a general fear that Visigothic kings deposited in divination and magical arts. And the list of practitioners that we find here, however, recalls very closely the etymology of Isidore. So, considering that he presided over this council, he might very much have influenced the wording of the acts. And also, this council is considered as the fundamental moment of consolidation of the Visigothic liturgy. And so its second canon states specifically the necessity of unity and uniformity of rites to avoid what it calls the variety of churches, varietas ecclesiarum. Nevertheless, these and later sources attest to the diffuse belief in these practices, not only by clerics procuring and using the service of magicians, but also of their being victims of these practitioners. So this tension reveals something that I think it's important, because clerics, they knew the scripture and canon law, but they also knew local beliefs, and they knew fears about weather and illness and death, and they were familiar with ritual repertoires inherited from pre-Christian traditions. And on this matter, Robert Wisniewski has argued that Christian authorities did not deny the perceived efficacy of divination. Rather, they attempted to resurrect it. So the result was a gray zone, a space of negotiation rather than total eradication. So local priests were products of this gray zone, and their knowledge was double, so doctrinal and experimental. So we see then that, at least in theory, clerics received a comprehensive education that required them to be versed not only in religious matters, but also in more secular disciplines. And understanding their cultural background, however, is a bit more difficult. But we know that they quite probably believed in magical practices and divinations, and we may assume that they were familiar with popular practices and beliefs, either through direct contact because they were in the middle of the people, or because they themselves emerge from the same cultural milieu. So now with these in mind, we can now examine these illicit practices. So which ecclesiastical documentation accused this man in order to reconstruct their activities as brokers. So now we go and try to answer our third question. So what were they doing? And one of the most important sources for illicit practices in Iberia is Bishop Martin of Braga. And Martin was born in Pannonia, but he arrived in the Iberian Peninsula in the mid-6th century, and he's retained to play a central role in the Christianization of the Suevi kingdom, so the kingdom that was occupying Galicia before the Visigoths. And at the request of a fellow bishop, he wrote a treatise that is known as the Correzione Rusticorum to instruct the people, the rustici, in proper Christian conduct. And so Martin he presided the Second Council of Braga of 572, and he appended to this council what we know as Capitula Martini. So it's a compilation of Eastern Councilor canons adapted to local needs. So among the canons that he selected, so he was not just a copy and pasting, he was actually selecting with a scope, and sometimes he was even changing this to probably to adapt to what he was retaining was useful for his community. So one of these canons is this canon from the Synod of Laodicea, which condemns clerics who perform bindings. So it is not permitted for clerics to be enchanters or to perform bindings, which is the binding of the soul. So the issue of clerical manufacturing these bindings, amulets, appeared a bit later in one of the sermons of Caesarius of Arles. And I went to cite Caesarius because he was operating in an environment that at that moment in Arles, in the south of France, was for most of part dominated by Visigothic kingdom. So in one of his canons, he says that often enough, people were resorting to these charms for they were receiving them from priests and religious. And he says these people, however, are not really religious or clerics, but the devil's helpers. So here we see clearly in Caesarius that people were using these amulets that were manufactured by priests. So here it is obvious. This is not clear in Martin's canon if clerics were acting independently or in response to lay demand. And we see in another canon, this time is a canon from the council, not a collection of other canons. It's a similar ambiguity in my view. And in this canon always from the Council of Braga, we see the condemnation of clerics who are celebrating masses at cemeteries. So it is not fitting for ignorance and presumptuous clerics to carry out ministries or distribute the sacraments over tombs in the open field. Rather, they should offer the oblation for the dead in the church. We have a number of comparable concerns facing funerary practices. And what all this canon and these other canons reveal is this recurring clerical involvement in these funerary rites. And at this moment, there was not a proper liturgy to celebrate funerals. So we might imagine that they were responding to lay expectations because the proper liturgy, funeral liturgy comes later. But a more explicit case appears in 17th Council of Toledo. And we are talking again about mass and about death. But this canon here, I want us to pay attention into the wording. Because in this canon, they were accusing clerics of celebrating funerary masses for the living with a harmless intent. So we're not reading it all here, but I want us to pay attention to the language. So it talks about deceit of enmity, and again, deceitfully and with a deceitful intent. And so celebrating it's sort of a curse. So celebrating a mass, a funerary mass for a living. And it's not clear here, but this practice may have involved financial motives because in another canon, at the Fourth Council of Toledo that I already mentioned, the bishops were forbidding the acceptance of payment for administering sacraments or ecclesiastical officers. So here in the 17th Council of Toledo, the canon repeatedly emphasizes deceit, right? And it's portraying this priest not as negligent, but as consciously perverting the sacred. So because they were entrusted with mediating divine truth through ritual, their misuse of the liturgy constituted a betrayal of that role. So now I went to, and this is the part in which I admit that it's a bit tentative. So now I propose that after we saw all of this to answer our last question. So why was it bad? And because we saw that there was a contrast when we were talking about the blessing of the fields, I mean that liturgy was we could say was official. right? And that one was not being considered as illicit. So this contract between tolerated and illicit practice, I think that does not lie primarily on the ritual form, but in their social orientation and the degree of the ecclesiastical control. So interventions that aim at protecting the crops, so the community's principal form of wealth and survival, could be framed as serving the common good and were more easily integrated into liturgical logic and also reinforced clerical mediation on behalf of the whole community. By contrast, rites that um, directed towards individual healing or the manipulation or harm or these funerary concerns operated in the more ambiguous and often liminal context because address private needs rather than collective welfare. So in these cases, clerics risk becoming personalized ritual specialists, so responding to specific demands and cultivating forms of authority that were less visibly regulated. So I want to think that so the problem was not ritual, but the form. And just to conclude and to wrap this, so these clerics, um, they occupied this a structural double position. So translating Christianity into what we can call a living religion, but translation, as we said, reshapes what it transmits. So from the perspective of their communities, they were indispensable mediators, but from the perspective of the consular legislation, they risk becoming traitors. So the position was powerful precisely because it was liminal, but it was also dangerous for exactly the same reason. So here are my thoughts, and I know that maybe I presented in very rush matter, but I very much look forward to your comments and to your feedback. And thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Lilian. Yeah, we have some time for questions or comments. Anybody want to raise any questions? I know raised a lot of questions for me. I'm very interested in this topic. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and oh, Christina, please go ahead. You can go first.
Thank you. Or if you want, you can raise your question first. So.
Go right ahead. I'll go second.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I have two questions, but both of them are related to materiality because you showed this phylactery that was written on stone. And I was wondering whether it has any kind of ritual markedness. How was it used at all? So was it written on stone because it was a deposit amulet or something like that? Or what's the role of stone in this? And my second question is very much related to this, that is it true that some kind of trends in materiality just were just transferred from the authorities to magical practice? For example, in Coptic studies, when parchment was much more in use in official and administrative manuscripts, you can see a similar trend in magical manuscripts as well. So there was a transfer of trend in the material. And I'm just interested in this, whether you could see such connections.
Here, yes. So thank you for this question. And well, that slate, it's unfortunately is a unicum, because the slate it belongs to a number of similar slates that we called as the pizarras, that were very typical from the period, but using the stone as to write many things. Okay, so it's not just, and this one is an unicorn because in this one we see this sort of charm, this phylacterian. The study that was made about this late actually compared it to other similar phylacterians from other regions. And even though we cannot, this is, as I said, the only slate of the sort that was found in the Iberian context, it is mirroring a tradition that can be seen elsewhere. So it can be identified as part of this tradition, and that's why it can be understood as having this ritualistic connotation, because it is very much similar to what is found in other contexts. From this context, we know better how it was the procedure, so the ritual of depositing it. So this is uh, the much we can say about this document. And so about the materiality of it, the only thing that can be said is, as I said, comparing it with other materials, because it's the one, the only one that we know from this tradition. But yeah, I don't know if this is what answers your question. I don't know if I lost something in the
I
middle.
think so, because then it's part of a kind of broader tradition.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It has been the study that I cited from Flores. He really situates it because he was doing this comparison. So that's the much we can say about it.
Thank you.
Great. Um, if I may, I'd like to raise a question or kind of maybe an issue in this regard. And it's really actually about the relationship of orthodoxy to um, these local clerics, because as it relates to kind of ritual practices like amuletic construction, etc., these are being worked out across multiple levels of society. John Chrysostom and Jerome disagree with the Council of Chalcedon. They're tolerant of phylacteria, whereas certain ecclesiastical councils are not. And so I think if we're thinking about these, and I think you can see the same thing actually operative in Egypt, that actually these people themselves that are participating in these practices are constructing their own notions of orthodoxy. So there's not really necessarily a tension. We see in the amulets from Egypt, for example, Christian creeds, playing on notions of canonicity, playing on anti-Jewish discourses. Like they're participating in the very same discourses of orthodoxy that are circulating around. And so I wonder if the tension between the two spaces is more a perceived tension based on a somewhat elite, non-elite distinction that we might be looking at, that actually in practice, since these people were kind of outside of real strict control over a bishop, that they were kind of shaping the kind of orthodoxy among the population.
Yeah, this is precisely the case. And actually, as I mentioned at somewhere in this presentation, it's this, what is considered orthodox is always up to debate, and debate by authorities themselves. And that's why I think that the problem is in the placing of authority, because we see, as you mentioned, they're not, we cannot, if we pick these sources and these documents and we try to build a model of orthodoxy, we will very much be puzzled and we'll very much be lost, because there was a lot of things that are allowed and not allowed. If we go beyond Iberia, for instance, Gregory of Tours himself was very much a guy that you could consider himself a wizard if we were look at him with this perspective, because he himself was manufacturing these things, when talking about his practices. So that's why I think that the stress is much more into authority, because when it's Gregory doing it, it's allowed because he's doing under his authority of bishops, and he's he's doing it under his authority of, an intellectual, and he cannot be considered, of course, a wizard, even though he himself is describing wizards that will say, well, so that's why I think that when he come back to this local clergy, they were pretty much doing things that we saw that even bishops themselves were accused of doing. But it was considered that bad, and they were framed as ignorant men, and they were framed as, using unorthodoxy, because they were just operating in this local and very individual level. So that's what I think, that it's not practice, it's not ritual per se, it's not exactly what was happening, but how it was happening and by whom. So yeah, I think that this is I pretty much agree with what you said, and that's why that's what I said. I don't know. I think this is a matter of um, just changing perspectives, because we are talking about this very local realities. Because when it's done elsewhere by other authorities, it's the way to see it's completely different.
Yeah, I've argued with respect to Augustine and Chrysostom, who are dealing with different kinds of situations where um, the practitioners, at least on occasion, that they have in mind are non-Christian, right? They're afraid that somebody's going to go over to a synagogue, or is going to, on a symbolic level, integrate Jesus into a larger system, right? And so you have even the notion of mixture syncretism is actually an ecclesiastical discourse more so than an anti one. But there's a certain sense of the way that their concern is precisely their inability to be able to shape the particular boundaries according to their own um, vision of Christianity. And I think you know it's an interesting thing, and you can see this in terms of the alternatives that they give. You can have with Augustine, it's wrong to have a ligatura, but you can sleep on the gospel, right? So that there's a certain sense in which what we're dealing here is different kinds of symbolic discourses. That the one is not purely Christian, the other one is conceptualized as purely Christian because it's simply just the gospel text, right? And it sends you to the church, it sends you to spaces, etc., that can be regulated in that regard. But it's interesting that in the case of these people that you're talking about, right, that there is a recognition that they are participating in the Christian space to a degree, but they're at the same time seen to be off, and yeah, I mean, you get that in the Council of Laodicea, obviously, and in other places. And Shenouda of Atrope complains about people going to monks, etc., to get these objects and other kinds of amuletic things. But it is interesting. I mean, I think I would agree that the notion of kind of authority, ability to kind of regulate practices, etc., especially within a context in which people are constructing different modes of orthodoxy, different ways of thinking about it. And yeah, no, I think it's a very, very interesting perspective that you highlighted. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is very recurring in the religious landscape of early medieval Iberia, this thing of regulating. There are many things that are trying to regulate, and even we have it. This is an example, but it's it's not very related to the topic, but even monasteries that are coming from a very popular initiative and needing to be regulated precisely because they are operating outside this sphere of so, and it's very, very, we have very interesting documentations about these monasteries and the attempts made by the religious authority to regulate them because they were just out of control. So that's why I think that mentioning also the fact that they were operating in a geographical area that was very much sparse and far from this, I think that this whole idea of legitimacy goes through this idea that they were isolated most of the times, and then creating this new or this not really new, but this more syncretic and more dangerous practices.
Yeah. And it's, so we don't have it in terms of material objects, we don't have a lot from
No.
from Egypt. If we look at that, the interesting thing is that the amulet producers were also trying to regulate amulet behavior. So the levels are happening. It's happening on multiple levels. They're doing the exact same thing to other practitioners that the church, in fact, even use the same tropes that church fathers would use against them. They use against rival practitioners. So there's a certain sense in which they're also regulating the discourses of proper ritual versus improper ritual. And so presumably in Iberia, you would see a similar kind of a thing. These are people who themselves are constructing their own orthodox practices and would probably condemn others who are doing it slightly different.
Yeah, but it's here. It's also clear that the discourse of regulating is that since we cannot prevent you to do so, here's the rule. So it's really clear that it was a battle that they lost, and so let's try to regulate in this.
Any other questions or comments? Anything? Yes, Maciej, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have a sort of a follow-up question upon the regulating process, more focused on the side of the, let's say, clients of the cultural brokers of these figures, because they would have probably, I assume, been perceived as liminal also from the side of like local communities. I wonder if we have any mentions of local communities. I don't know. Perceiving the practitioners also as doing something illicit or something problematic. I understand that it's difficult because most of the perspective that we have is from the church authorities, but I wonder if anything can be said also on for the part of the let's say ordinary people. Of course, there would have been very big notions between learned ordinary people sort of and villagers, and there's a lot of plasticity in this as well. But I'm just wondering if we have any visible input from the side of the local communities.
Well, that's very, very difficult to say because as you mentioned, having their input, we just have, of course, indirect testimony. So in this case, for instance, the hermit that I mentioned, Valerius, when he's talking about describing these people, he says, well, and then when I said them this person was just an imposter, they agreed with me and this person was banned. But, it's just Valerius. We cannot trust him because, as I said, he was very critic and he was actually trying to, his whole discourse was trying to be an educational discourse. So he was writing for the education of monks. So he was trying to show, so see, this is what it was supposed, this is what's wrong. And so we understand that his hand is very heavy into describing wrong and into describing the way to persecute wrong. So I think that from this point of view, it's pretty much what we have. And also the language that we have in council documentation is also very stereotypical. So when they say, we know that people are still doing it, or it came to our knowledge that people are, it's stereotypical. So we know that they were. So that's why I think it's important to work with many tools that we have, and also comparing with other regions, because yeah, the language is stereotypical, but we cannot deny that something was happening, because even we realize and we admit that is with stereotypical language, it's being repeated very often. So why is the point to repeat so often something that was not happening? So it's not, you're not gaining nothing into it. So yeah, I think that believing in the language very strictly is not what we want, but believing that something was happening, I think it's plausible, and that there were people operating into these intersections. I think it's yeah, it's very much plausible as well.
Well, thank you very much, Lilian, for a wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. And for everyone, Piera put a message in the chat for our next event, which is going to be on the 18th of March, which is on a very different topic, but still in this issue of the illicit and lived religion. Which is looking at abortion and infanticide in Japanese communities during the 16th and 17th centuries. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again on the 18th of March.